Hello, welcome to this short video on doing a two-way mixed design in SPSS. So you'll see here I've set the data up that I have one between subjects variable labelled IV1 and one within subjects variable labelled IV2. And as this is within subjects, every participant takes part in both of those conditions. So I've labelled it IV2 level 1 and IV2 level 2. So this could be a before and after factor, or it could be on two separate dimensions of a scale, or it could be under two separate conditions. So some score. So this score represents the dependent variable, or the score that we're interested in, and this is one condition, and this is another condition of this factor. So in your design, you would obviously label these whatever is appropriate for your analyses. What we would assume here is that we've tested for the assumptions, and assuming that these dependent variables are normally distributed in order to run the two-way mixed ANOVA. But what makes it a two-way mixed ANOVA is that we have two factors, factor 1 and factor 2. One of those factors is between subjects, so participants take part in either condition 1, condition 2 or condition 3, and the other factor is within subjects, so they take part in both of those parts of the study, and they have scores on the two variables, or the two parts of this, the two levels of this factor. To run the analyses, we would click on Analyze, General Linear Model, and as it is a mixed design, it has within subjects or repeated measures elements. So as such, we go to Repeated Measures. That brings up this dialog box. So we need to define our within subjects factor first of all. Well, this is IV2. So it also asks for the number of levels, where you can see here this has 2 levels. So again, depending on your design, you would define the factor name as an appropriate name relevant to your variable of study, and the number of levels that that has. As it's a two-way design, you could have a number, this would be a 3 by 2 design, because we have 3 levels of factor 1 and 2 levels of factor 2. But obviously we could have more than 3 levels or 2 levels of factor 1 and more than 2 levels or 3, 4 or 5 levels of factor 2. This is a fairly simple one with a 3 by 2 design. So now we can define this. It brings up this separate box. It asks us to define the within subjects factors variables and the between subjects factors variables. So our between subjects factor has been labelled correctly, and this is known as IV1 or factor 1, so we shall put that in there. And these are the two within subjects factors, so this would be level 1 and this would be level 2 of our IV2. Now I'll just move those across appropriately, so you can see here level 1, numbered 1, level 2, numbered 2. If we had more than 2 within subjects factors, which is say a 3-way design, we'd need to ensure that these are really put into the right boxes appropriately. We can run some options on here. It's always important to look at some means for each of our factors or independent variables, and the interaction effect. I'm going to have some descriptive statistics and estimates of effect size. I'm also going to run some plots. So with plots, I don't know what the results will show at this stage, so I don't know which plot will represent the results best. So I shall put in 2 plots, one which has factor 1 along the horizontal axis and factor 2 as separate lines, and I'll add that. Another one which has factor 2 along the horizontal axis and factor 1 as separate lines, and I shall run that. And I shall continue and then click on OK. In terms of the output, it tells us first of all that our IV2 has 2 levels, and these would be the names of those, and that's the within subjects factor. Our between subjects factor has 3 levels. They've just been labelled condition 1, condition 2 and condition 3 in this case, and there are 10 participants in each of those conditions. All participants take part in these, so there'll be 30 participants in these each of these. There are some descriptive statistics, so for each level of the IV2 we have the scores on each of those conditions and the overall score and their standard deviations, and for the level 2 on the IV2 we have the 3 levels, their scores and their total score. We don't at this stage need to worry about the multivariate tests. The Moschly's test of sphericity is important if we have more than 2 levels of the within subjects factor, because this looks at the similarity in the different scores in terms of the variance. So we need to check here if this is significant if we have more than 2 levels of the within subjects factor. Now our within subjects factor only has 2 levels, so sphericity is not an issue. This table looks at our within subjects effects. We have already decided that sphericity is not an issue, so we do not need to do any corrections, so I shall assume sphericity, and therefore I can delete the other variables of interest, the non-sphericity variables and the contrast table, excuse me. So this is there a main effect of IV2? And it says yes, it's highly significant. There's a main effect of IV2 with a relatively large effect size. This is problematic somewhat, partially to squared for within subjects, so but it's just what SPSS generates, so we'll leave it there for the moment. This is IV2 in relation to IV1, so is there an interaction effect between people's scores when they're in on these factors, dependent on their level of these conditions? And what this shows me is that there isn't an interaction effect, so there seems to be one main effect for the IV2, the factor 2, and no interaction effect. This table shows me by between subjects, so again remember it's important within a two-way design that there are 3 effects: the effects of the first variable, the effects of the second variable, and the interaction effect between the first and the second variable. So we've seen that there's an effect of one variable, no interaction effect, and there is no effect of the other variable. So of the 3 effects we've studied in this design, only one of those is significant, and that is of IV2. So I'm not really worried about the means on IV1 here. They can be useful just to describe and say there's no significant difference between those. But as this is only 2 levels, we do not need to do post hocs. The difference between these is significant. We know in IV2, what we can see here is level 2 is much higher than level 1. And so that's important to note when we write up our significance. The interaction effect is not significant. So what we can see here is in condition 1, that difference seems to be the same. In condition 2, level 1 is still lower than level 2, and in condition 3, level 1 is also lower than level 2. This should be represented in the graph below. So we can see here the separate lines are for the IV2, so the scores are very high, irrespective of their level on the condition on the IV1, and much lower on level 1 of IV2, again irrespective of their level on condition on IV1. So shown here, but we have IV1 and IV2 as along the bottom line, and separate lines for the IV2's level 1 and level 2 along the bottom line, and separate lines for the 3 conditions of IV1. I think this first one shows the results better, so this would be the one that I would use in my write-up. So hopefully that's explained how to run a two-way mixed ANOVA in SPSS.